Thank you. Thank you very much, Brett. You all heard him. He said that I can go on and on and on. You will all live to regret that. Seriously, I know that I stand between you and your next cup of tea, so I will try to be brief, and we'll see how long the Q&A goes. It is a real pleasure to be with you. I want to thank Brett for inviting me. Obviously, that's wonderful. I should say I was there in person a few years ago. I don't know if I'm going to be able to show this to you adequately. This is let's see. Yeah, this is my travel umbrella from Griffith University, which I got, I think it was 2015. Amazingly enough, in London, I haven't had any use for an umbrella. I think this is the first time that's ever happened to anybody. But I'm going to be back in Brisbane for a long weekend, or a long week, I guess, in March. So I am looking forward to being there again. Today, as you know, I'm halfway around the world. Normally, I know I recognize some of you, obviously not all of you, but those of you who have heard me speak before are aware that I have been giving a series of lectures at ATA conferences over the last, I think it's 11 years. In which I have made sort of increasingly frantic statements about the political condition in the United States. And my hook in all of those lectures is to say that the normal thing to do when someone from one country is invited to speak to scholars in another country is to talk about our common scholarly overlap, which in this case is obviously taxation. But the problem has been that every time I have thought to myself, what could I talk about that would be useful and predictive for people from the other side of the world to think about the United States tax system, the answer has continued to be that there is no longer any predicting policy developments, or for that matter, political developments in the United States, because long before an orange-haired man came along, the country's political system was already showing signs of fracturing. And so I think there's some irony that now I'm not speaking to you from the United States, I'm speaking to you from the United Kingdom on the very day that a different orange-haired man has been booted out of office. So I seem to bring political chaos wherever I go. You might, Brett might want to reconsider that invitation for March. But one of the reasons I was excited about this invitation is that it gave me the rare opportunity to talk about something other than political Armageddon. Because Brett suggested that I might want to talk about retirement issues, and in particular retirement issues as the world becomes more integrated and workers cross borders with increasing frequency. I can say that I'm not going to completely abandon my negativism, because I think that what's likely to happen in the United States over the next several years is that both in terms of official changes in law, but also in terms of incentives, crossing the borders in and out of the United States will be much less appealing and much less likely. So that's my political prediction. But as far as I can tell, the rest of the world will continue to integrate. And again, I mean, most of you will probably look at what happens in the United States in the next several years and think, I don't want to go there. Just as I'm thinking, even as I'm in London's chaos, I'm thinking, well, I'll take this compared to the alternative. Um, so the question then is, how do we think about, no matter who is crossing borders? Again, I'm saying that basically there's going to be a big hole in the global system where the United States used to be. But for those who are crossing borders, we need to think about the, the question of how to support their retirement. And if you had a chance to read the abstract for my talk, you'll notice that I sort of jumped into the middle of the story and just started talking about defined benefit plans and defined contribution plans and the sort of insider talk. But I wanted to frame my remarks here a little bit more fundamental. Because the reason I started teaching the deferred compensation class at University of Florida is that I had spent a long time studying the American system, the government retirement system, which we call Social Security. I know in other countries, Social Security has a broader meaning. But in the United States, anyway, Social Security means the all but universal government retirement program that people pay into during their working lives and then draw benefits from under a legally determined schedule upon qualifying for retirement. It's been in existence since 1935. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that, and by the way, those of you who know me will know that I am absolutely not an America First, rah-rah, wear a red hat kind of American. So it's pretty rare when I hold up the United States as a shining example. But I think it is fair to say that the Social Security program in the U.S. is one of the most successful social programs ever. Among the ways that we know that is that it turned, it came in the middle of the Great Depression, and it turned a massive crisis of elder poverty into a non-problem in very short order. If anything, the success has been so notable that over the decades, people look at the Social Security system and say, well, look at how well we treat elders. Maybe we treat them too well. So the system is sort of a victim of its own, a political victim of its own success, but it is so successful that even with ideological attacks on it, the system continues. For example, during the 2016 presidential campaign, when everybody thought that Donald Trump was going to lose and lose badly, one of the things that he did that was a real break with Republican orthodoxy, and as you know, he did that a lot. He was a real disruptor. But he understood who his audience was, who his supporters were, basically old white people, to be quite blunt about it. And so he ended up deciding to support Social Security and Medicare, which is our universal old age health insurance program. And so, it was a very odd situation where somebody who was sort of a truly radical right-wing disruptor basically said, but I'm not going to touch the two big social insurance programs. And so there is some hope that even if the political system overall falls apart in the way that I've been predicting, we will have something like the Social Security program going forward. And the reason I bring all that up is because it is, in some ways, not only has it been very successful, but it is, I'm going to argue today that it might be something that can be made universal. And that, and by universal, I mean not just across one country, but across many countries. Um, I will also say that having just qualified a minute ago to say that I'm not a big American chauvinist by any stretch of the imagination. 5 years ago, I was visiting the ATAC's visiting scholar at UNSW, and I was going around your country giving lectures. And one of the universities in Perth, I think it was, I was giving my talk, and I said, that I studied the Australian super system to a certain degree. And I said, I hate to be an ungracious guest, but I have to tell you, the American retirement system is superior. And the dean of the host law school almost completely lost it. He was, I mean, he became very exercised and said, America's wrong about everything. And I said, well, almost everything. But in any case, I think it's important to talk not just about the defined benefit and defined contribution programs, but to talk about something like a universal government program. For reasons that I will now go into in some detail. Part of the problem in thinking about retirement security is that it's too easy to dive into the financial minutia very quickly, right? Even people who aren't tax experts, as soon as they hear anything about retirement, they start wanting to talk about, little tiny details that can be important and that, their accountant told them, they ought to think about. But I find that it's useful to think about how every retirement system confronts the same set of problems, and the differences between the sort of fundamental approaches to financing it are in some ways very important, but in some ways actually illusions. They're not actually different in the ways that we often think they are. So if you think about retirement, it is a relatively modern thing. For that matter, childhood, as we understand childhood, is actually a relatively modern thing, because in rudimentary societies, everybody who can work has to work all the time, and from the moment you can pick up a tool until the moment you lay down for your last time out of exhaustion. And so the opportunity to create long periods of non-work is a very modern luxury. Okay, and so one of the reasons the reason I think it's important to talk about that is because it means that no matter how it's financed, people who are in retirement, and this is circular reasoning, but it's worth emphasizing the definitional aspects of this. If you are in retirement, you are not producing goods and services, but you are consuming goods and services, right? That's also true of childhood. Okay, and so the people who are producing goods and services have to overproduce compared to what would be necessary to keep their needs satisfied. And so the big question in setting up any retirement system is how do we decide whether we're going to allow people not to work? And if we do decide that we're going to allow them not to work, how do we decide when they get that luxury, and when they stop working, how do we decide how much they get to continue to consume now that they're not consuming? Now that they're not producing. Okay. Now again, these are really fundamental concepts, but I'm building towards something. And so if you think about the alternatives, the only way for an individual or even a small group of individuals to prepare for their retirement in a non-social way would be to lay up supplies to be drawn down during their non-working years, right? But almost all of the supplies that we need can't be laid up, right? You know, the medicines that we will need in our old age, the adult diapers, you know, all those things, you know, ongoing expenses. You know, some of them, you know, like the diapers, can actually be stockpiled. But you know, food items, medicine items, all those types of things have to be simultaneously produced, right? So you can't just say, I'm going to go out in a cabin in the woods or you know, in the middle of Australia and just live on my own. I assume you don't have any woods in the middle of Australia, but you get the idea. So what we're trying to figure out is how to qualify people to draw off of other people's labor. All right, you know, because during our working years, we you know, the rudimentary idea is that we trade with each other. I mean, you know, it's pretty abstract at this point. I mean, it's hard to imagine how I could barter what I do for, you know, pints of beer and bowls of ramen, but because that's pretty much what I live on. But you know, the sort of trade amongst workers is a pretty easy thing to think about. But trade amongst non-workers with workers, right? You know, that is a not only a difficult coordination issue, but even more importantly, it creates a vulnerability issue and a trust issue that is completely unsolvable, right? And by unsolvable, what I mean is you just have to trust that without ever being able to guarantee it, that the rules that you sign up for and the deal that you think you're going to get won't be pulled out from underneath you after the fact, right? When you know, when when you've already retired and it's too late to go back into the labor force. Okay, so the first notion of setting up a retirement system is to say you need to figure out how to get people, how to let people know how to qualify for it, how to alter what they're going to be able to get out of it, but then you have to get them to say, and I believe you. Right? I really don't think that this is going to be taken away from me. And the problem is that it always could be. Right? Even more than with children, right? You know, there's sort of more social expectation that, you know, that children won't be sort of left to fend for themselves. But to give you, this might have made international news at the time because it was pretty outrageous. But at the very early stages of the lockdown, as it started in the United States, the lieutenant governor of Texas, and I should say, being from Florida, or now living in Florida for 3 years, it's nice to be able to point at a state that's even crazier than mine. And Texas certainly fulfills that role. But the lieutenant governor of Texas went on a TV program and basically said, I'm in my 70s, I've had a good run. I'm not going to, I don't think it makes sense for me to destroy the economy of my children, and I should, you know, if COVID kills me, it kills me. And if it kills a bunch of other seniors, it kills a bunch of other seniors. But we owe future generations a functioning economy, so we should just reopen right away. This is like April 2020. He's saying this. It was not a popular point of view, but it wasn't a completely isolated argument, a statement on this guy's part. His name is Dan Patrick. And the idea that he was getting at was, the reason I bring it up here is because, as I was saying, it's one thing to say children don't work, but we're not going to just say, the heck with you, right? I mean, we can change child labor laws, so even that's a lot more adjustable than we might tend to think. But it is at least less outrageous as a social statement to just say, you want to stop working, that's on you. And if you trust us, there's a movie from the 1970s called Animal House that, believe me, does not hold up very well in terms of modern sensibilities. But I'll clean up the language. But there's a famous one-liner in there where a younger guy is very upset at his older fraternity brothers, and the response is, "Hey, you effed up. You trusted us." Right? And basically when it was too late. And that's what that's the threat of a retirement system. Right? The threat of being in a situation where you're vulnerable, you got yourself into a position where you thought you could rely, and you can't. And when you're really just sort of left to die. Okay? Happily, that hasn't happened much lately in countries like ours, anyway. And so the big issue has become, as I mentioned in my abstract, that for a long time, not only were economies mostly national, but they were also, even within a nation, they were local, at least to the degree that you could, that a government could use employers as a proxy to finance a retirement system. Okay. Now, even that is a big leap, because even if you believe that you don't want older people to just be left to walk out into the tundra and die, right, or work themselves to death as we used to in pre-industrial times, why is it the government's concern? Right? I mean, I say that not because I believe the rhetorical question, but I have to pose the rhetorical question, which is, everybody knows that there's going to be a point where they might want to stop working. It's up to them, right? If they want to finance that, then they can either find people that they trust to who promise to let them live in the guest room and and eat meals with them, or they can try to put money away in a savings account, right? But notice that savings accounts are government creations as well, right? Or more importantly, they're government creations in the way that is the most important here, which is the trust issue, right? I mean, we know from the history of finance that if you take a profit-seeking organization and give them what's called a time inconsistency advantage, right, you are going to see a lot of fraud. Right? So, you can't just say, I mean, you can, but it's dishonest to say, well, the government should just be out of this. Just let people put money into savings accounts. Right? The government's involved in that. right? In a way that absolutely has everything to do with guaranteeing that people will be able to rely um, on promises. Now, those promises can change, right? So, for example, at this point, there are various tax treatments for retirement savings in the United States, lots of tax advantages. Those can change, right? You say, oh, well, it's a long-term commitment. No, it's not. You know how political systems work. If the government decided that it didn't want to exempt retirement income from taxation anymore, the government could change its mind at any time, right? The government also can indirectly threaten people's future retirement by, for example, changing fiduciary rules, right? So that the government doesn't extract the surplus from hapless retirees, but the government allows some rent-seeking, well-lobbied business to come in and drain off what people thought was going to be their retirement income. Okay, so there's fundamentally a government commitment that is trying to say, people, you can trust that the way you're arranging your retirement income will work for you. Okay, but just as people have reasons to be skeptical about how well an annuity company would treat them if not kept to the rules, people also have reasons to be skeptical about a government itself changing those rules. Okay, so why does this all matter? When I was saying that the way any retirement system has to work, if you're going to have a modern economy with something even resembling what we think of as a retirement system, then it used to be that you could count on starting to work right after you finish school, and with a high degree of confidence, believe that you are going to be with that employer for throughout your working life, and that the employer would then provide for you, right? And it could be an explicit, we, the employer, are going to provide for you. Here is your pension plan, right? But employers figured out pretty quickly that they wanted to outsource that, right? So investment companies came into existence to allow businesses to shift the administrative responsibility and a certain amount of risk, right? But but the basic idea was the government doesn't have to be any more involved than it otherwise would be, and there are lots of ways in the background the government is involved, but it doesn't have to be more involved because, again, the employers can be the proxy, all right? They're stepping in for the government to say, here's how we're going to arrange your post-retirement consumption. And so as long as that model worked, it worked well. In the United States, I'm sure that Australia and other countries have had their own versions of this, but in the United States in around the late 1950s, we had a big scandal when one of the, for those of you who are automobile enthusiasts, you might recognize the nameplate Studebaker. They were, one of the companies that didn't last past the 50s. And when they went bust, it turned out that with the aiding and abetting of the employers' union, the United Auto Workers, the employees' union, the United Auto Workers, that Studebaker had been draining funds out of the pension plan. Now, that was, under the circumstances, actually not entirely corrupt, because it was a classic situation where you could be well-meaning and hopeful and imagine, I'll just take some money out of that drawer for a couple of months to tide us over, and then everything will get good again, and I'll put the money back, right? And we know how those stories end. Well, this ended really badly. And within the space of a few months, a rather large industrial workforce had not only lost lost their jobs, but they were told that I think the way the wind down worked was already retired workers did continue to receive full benefits. That wasn't required by law. That's just what Studebaker agreed to do. I think if you were vested but not retired, so basically if you'd been with the company for 20 years, you got 15 cents on the dollar of the original promise, and the unvested people got zero. Okay. And so that led to the creation of one of the most confusing laws ever written in the United States. It's called ERISA, and I can't even remember what that's short for. But I think the R is retirement. That's as far as I can get in ERISA. But the idea behind ERISA was that we had to find an alternative to prevent companies from doing to their workers what Studebaker had done to its workers. At the same time, and by which I mean in the decades immediately following the Studebaker, what we now call the Studebaker incident, the other big change was the increasing frequency with which people would change employers. And so that's where we went from what we call defined benefit programs, like a traditional pension, to a defined contribution program, right? Now that the defined contribution, of course, is a massive risk shift, right? Because basically what the defined benefit plan, the employer is on the hook for full benefits unless they can figure out a way to weasel out of it, right? So worker signs up. They're especially if they're unionized, there's paper that says, you work this many years, you'll get the final 3 years of your salary. Average those together, and you'll get 60% of that. Would be a typical defined benefit. Okay. And so if the employer couldn't come up with that, then it was the employer who had to go out and borrow money or find some way to cover the difference. Unless they couldn't, in which case the whole thing fell apart and the workers lost anyway. Defined contribution plans essentially just say, well, the employer doesn't care anymore. The employer is now almost entirely an administrative aid to the government, basically saying, enacting what amounts to what I think of as very good paternalism, which is if you don't set up incentives and automatic mechanisms to get people to save for their retirement, then they will undersave, right? This is like one of the most predictable social science phenomena out there, right? People are myopic about their retirements. And so the shift to defined contribution plans wasn't just well, let's just leave it on the workers now, although it certainly shifted all the risk onto the workers, right? But what it said was, we're going to shift the risk onto the workers. We're going to relabel the money that the employer was putting into the defined benefit trust fund, right, with the investment company. We're going to relabel that pre-tax income for the workers, but then the workers are required to put that into a defined contribution account. I know I'm not telling you anything mechanically that you're not aware of, but as you know, the major difference between the Australian system now and the Australian system in the past, and the U.S. Social Security system throughout this, is that as a matter of labeling, the SuperAN system is a defined contribution plan, but as you've seen, and again, this is what I think of as very good paternalism. You can't just say, "Go at it," right? You know, the whole system is not just to say you have to put in a certain amount of money, but you have all kinds of restrictions on how much on the types of investments that people are allowed to pour their money into, right? You know, so Ponzi schemes are out, you hope, and all those types of things. And so when I teach the American system to my students at Florida, one of the things I do is I contrast it with the Australian system, but in a way that's designed to show that it's not really that much of a contrast, right? Because essentially, the American Social Security system is one thing that I'll get back to the details of in a minute. But the supplement to that, now that we almost nobody has defined benefit pensions anymore in the United States. The only sector that has anything like it is government jobs. And the U.S. government sector is much smaller than in most of our peer countries and shrinking. And so the rules on defined contribution plans are essentially logically equivalent to all of the limitations that that your parliament has had to put onto SuperAN in order to make it not a trap, right, for the unwary, right, for workers who are, oh, well, you know, I can just put all of my money in crypto. You know that's going to work out very well. So the way people used to think about retirement was called the three-legged stool. And the idea behind that was that you would have your defined benefit pension through your employer, you would have the Social Security program through the government, and then you would have your defined contribution savings that are subsidized by the government. And now that pensions are going away, right, the defined benefit pensions, it's down to the remaining two. And it turns out that one of the ways in which the U.S. definitely doesn't do things as well as Australia does is on the defined contribution side, we tolerate a ridiculous amount of inequality, right? I mean, you know, I'm sure you've heard the reports about the high and growing wealth inequality in the U.S. and income inequality in the U.S. Retirement savings inequality is even more extreme. Neil, and I mean, to the point where more than half. I'm sorry. Was
just 10 minutes
to get my attention?
Just 10 minutes.
10 minutes until I need to stop talking, or 10 minutes until it's all done?
10 minutes till questions.
10 minutes till questions. Okay,
Brilliant.
Got it. Thank you. Well, now I've lost my train of thought. Why don't I start over? No, I'm just kidding. The inequality in the U.S. is such that if you look at retirement savings and defined contribution plans, more than half of American workers have zero, right? And the next 40% have under $50,000 total, all right? In a country where, you know, the average annual income is something like 70,000, okay? So we've got trillions of dollars that are in these defined contribution plans, but they're all, you know, people who are doing fine anyway. Okay. Now, to get back to the question that I asked, or to get to the question that I asked in the title of my piece, what changes when we go from very local economies and very reliable long-term employment relationships to very thinking very nationally and very unreliable more and more gig-like relationships, and you say you then add in cross-border migration, and you ask, does that change anything? It feels like it should, right? You know, I mean, over the course of the last 20 years, when I switched from teaching economics into teaching law, if there's one buzzword, it's globalization, right? You know, and that's supposed to change everything. In fact, as Brett pointed out, one of my titles at the University of Florida is the Director of Global Scholarly Initiatives. And we still don't know what that means, but it has the word global in it, so that's good. And the reason that that matters is because I'm willing to argue, at least tentatively, that in this case, globalization should change nothing. Right? I'm not saying that nothing should change, but what I'm saying is the things that should change whether there's an increasing cross-border labor movement or not. Okay. One of the questions that I hinted at in my abstract, or one of the considerations that I hinted at, was the possibility that that a government would be worried about people building up their entitlement to retirement income and then taking it abroad and spending it abroad. Right, and you say, well, you know, that, like, I could see from the standpoint of an exchequer that you might, you know, be a little bit worried about that. But if you think about the fundamental nature of what the retirement relationship is supposed to be about, right? You know, it shouldn't matter to the government whether or not the person who is now retired spends the money domestically or abroad. First of all, because what really matters is that they were in the country while they were working, right? So you say, you know, all those years, the country that they were in had retirees who were receiving goods and services under whatever financial arrangements that country happens to have. But people were receiving goods and services that worker was overproducing, right? As I said at the very beginning of my talk, like everybody who's working is producing more goods than they actually need. Okay, so they paid in. And the idea that, you know, now you take your money and you say, oh, okay, well, I don't want to live in Australia anymore. I want to live somewhere else, and I'm going to take my money with me, right? Well, it's true that you're not going to spend the money in Australia, but you are also not going to put a burden on the productive capacity of Australians producing for Australians. All right. In other words, I take my money and leave, but I also take my need for your food and your beer and everything else, and I tell some other country to meet those needs for me. Right. So from the standpoint of an argument to keep money domestically, it's a pretty weak argument, and I would argue that in fact there's a logical neutrality there that should say, not only should the government not try to do that, they shouldn't even want to try to do that, right? That being able to move abroad at any time, like during your working life, then moving back, then moving out, then moving back, as long as you can administratively keep track of what the person is doing and what they are eligible for, then you're good, right? And that's where I was saying that our Social Security program, our being the United States Social Security program, matters to the story, because the American Social Security program is a fully, within the United States, a fully portable defined benefit program, right? We don't think of it that way because we call it a government pension plan. But it has exactly the same design as a defined benefit plan that you get from your employer, except that you don't have to stick with that employer to get it, right? But since defined benefit plans and defined contribution plans differ only from the standpoint of risk shifting, right? What you should be able to say is, if you think that it makes sense to have to have something like the American Social Security system and something not like Superan, it shouldn't matter to you whether or not your workforce is mobile and fluid or not. Right? You would do exactly what we do, even if they're not fluid. You keep track of their working hours. You have an entitlement formula, and you go with it, right? But on the other hand, if you think that Superan makes sense for any of a number of other reasons, and you don't want to have an economy-wide defined benefit government-run program, that's fine too. But Superan should be fully cross-border mobile as well. Right? So this is all my very long-winded way of saying that there's nothing to see here. Right? You know, that you think like, oh, the world is changing, it's global. Yeah, it is. But in fact, the differences in the way we finance retirement systems, even within a country without labor mobility, are logically essentially identical, other than the way we label things and where we place the risk, so that once you open the border, nothing changes, right? You know, if you like your plan for domestically, you should like it in a more globalized world, and vice versa. Okay. Very non-technical. I didn't want to get into, Section 33(1) of ERISA, because my students hate me when I do that, and I don't mind if they hate me, but I want you all to like me, especially since I might be fleeing my country soon. So thank you for listening. Brad, I'm sorry I worried you there. You were sure that I was going to take you up on that, and I almost did.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant, Neil. I'll first open up questions to our participants online. Does someone have a question online? Just raise your hand or unmute yourself. Adrian, Tony, Christine? Okay, well, I'll take my prerogative as chair. One of the things that your talk really highlighted to me is about medical risk, in terms of spending in that, but in terms of, yes, you've got someone who's worked in Australia, saved in Australia, maybe go overseas to retire and does their spending, but then when the pandemic hits, they come home to Australia and then become for want of a better word, a burden on the health system, but maybe they spend a lot of their retirement savings overseas. So I suppose that dichotomy about, in terms of retirement system, a big part of it that maybe is not taken into the equation is the health system, which particularly in Australia, where we've got Medicare, and that isn't really a part of the health, like part of the retirement system that's not talked about in terms of the equation, in terms of the cost to the government. We talk about the cost to the government in terms of lost revenue for superannuation, but I don't think we take into account the medical system. Did you want to make a comment about that, Neil?
Well, yeah, that's a great point. I mean, one of the am I muted?
No, you're perfect. We can hear you
Okay.
loud and clear.
Okay. I know that there's some sort of lag on the call here from 12,000 miles away, so I'm sorry for that. As your question suggests, Brett, the interesting difference here is that the healthcare system is universal, right? I mean, even like in the United States, where we claim it's not a universal system, in one way or another, there's a healthcare system, and even if people use the healthcare system in very unequal ways, as they do in the United States, it's still not an age-specific thing. Now, in America, Medicare is a different way of financing medical care for retirees. But that's a choice of how to finance medical care. Now, the only way that retirees are different from the standpoint of well, let me frame it this way. What I'm saying is that retirement income security is a retirement question. Medical care is not a retirement question. The way it seems like a retirement question is that old people seem to use a lot more medical care than young people do, right? It turns out that at least in the United States, that's not as it's a little counterintuitive, because although it's true that a large chunk of healthcare expenditures go on to the elderly, it goes on to not exactly being old, it's being almost dead. That the finance of the healthcare system, if you look at how much gets spent, no matter if you die at age 45 or 65 or 85, right? I mean, unless you get killed in a car crash or something like that, if you die over time, that's when you suck up the healthcare dollars, right? And so the healthcare system is essentially an insurance system against not dying quickly enough and cleanly enough, no matter your age. Whereas a retirement system is, when do you get to stop working?
I love how economists can really put things really emotionally and with such beautiful nuance. So yeah, I think, but to me it's interrelated in the sense that, like, part of it, particularly that idea of risk, is like, I would love to know when I was going to die, so then I could do my budget and I'd be super happy with that and I can plan. But that's just me. Adrian, you've got your hand up. I'll pass to you for a question.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you, Neil, for such an interesting presentation. My question, and it's related to what you're saying, is you're talking about it should be easy to be able to move to and from jurisdictions taking your super or pension. If you've got a very different taxation approach to it, like New Zealand has, where there's no incentives to save, so we call it big T, then there's a little t on your scheme, and then you get exempt when it comes out. Do you see any challenges or problems when you have such different schemes if people want to be mobile between countries? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I wish I had been in New Zealand the last time I spoke to you in January. Yes, you raised the point that was implicit in my comments, that under anything like a defined contribution program or a defined benefit program, even at the Social Security national level, you do need tracing, right? You do need individualized accounting. That doesn't necessarily mean having money in savings accounts, because savings accounts themselves are just legal fictions, right? But you certainly need a legal framework to determine who is entitled to how much when. I mean, as you're describing the New Zealand system, the people who are contributing while they're working are doing their job. They're doing it in exactly the way that I've described. You know, they're overproducing, and other people are getting the fruits of their labors, right? So when they retire, they ought to get theirs, right? They ought to, you know, get their opportunity to be retired. But certainly, if you are going to start having more cross-border movement of workers, then it does put a bookkeeping burden on that your country to this point has avoided.
Questions from the floor here in Brisbane? Yeah. Yes, I think I'll pass you the microphone.
Thank you for the talk, Neil. I'm just wondering if you've put any thought into sovereign risk across different countries. I actually have a live example. My parents are immigrating tonight from South Africa to Australia. They are pensioners, but they're not allowed to move their pension funds across to Australia because of the different rules. So they can still withdraw their pension on a continual basis, but they can't move the capital across. So in their minds, there's a big discrepancy between they're moving for some obvious reasons, and they are leaving a lot of the capital in a country where there could be considered to be more sovereign risk. So they don't really have this ability to move money across, and they consider that risk to remain. Have you thought about, you know, there are a lot of countries like Australia and the US that have, and New Zealand, that have fairly similar systems and have sophisticated networks or institutions or methods in which to track these retirement funds. But what about other countries where it's not that sophisticated and you might have more of that sovereign risk? Have you put any thought into that?
Yeah, a great question. Thank you. In a way, this is an application of what I was saying about how a government can confiscate in indirect ways, right? Because it's one thing to say, okay, you can't come into my country and draw off of a system that you never contributed into. But if another government, without coordinating with the first government, says, and you can't take the money that you set aside for your retirement, then what you have is, you know, a pincer movement, where, you know, you did everything right during your working years, and now in your non-working years, you're thinking, okay, I'm covered. And this is just a different way for the rules to be changed so that you're just stuck. And so it's in this way, it's not even sovereign risk really. It's just outright confiscation. And so, you know, one of the things that really matters for this is not just the tracing that I was describing, but certainly coordination. You know, if you're going to say you can't draw from our retirement system however we design it, then other countries have to at least be willing to say, you know, if you let our people into your country, you know, they will bring their retirement entitlements with them, right? So, you know, so this is a not tax issue that arises with the globalization. So when I said that nothing changes with globalization, what I meant was nothing about the way you think about the taxation and benefit structures of retirement systems, but certainly a lot of legal questions arise that would have to be addressed in a way that's, I guess, similar to tax treaties, right? That, you know, you've essentially got to say, people want to move around, and you can't have the equivalent of double taxation. You know, you have to work out a way to allow money to cross borders with the people to whom it belongs, but more accurately, the deferred gratification that they engaged in throughout their working lives. You can't just say, well, okay, thanks, but we're keeping it. Now get out. You know, that's obviously unjust, and you know, it does get more complicated once you have multiple sovereigns in that sense. So great question. Thank you.
This is what I love about when you talk about retirement. It just gets all so aggressive. I'm mindful of the time, and Neil, I know it's past 1 a.m. now in London, and just to rub it in, it's 21 degrees in Brisbane, beautiful sunshine, and we've really appreciated your keynote. It's been so insightful and really given us a lot of food for thought, even though it's a huge issue for governments around the world, as well as you talk about the risk sharing in terms of the risk on individuals now and what that means in terms of their own mobility, but also their own retirement savings. Can I ask everyone here in the room and everyone online to show our thanks to Professor Neil Buchanan?